Hello, history buffs. Today we're talking about the Bronze Age, particularly Egypt's role in the Bronze Age. But since John Green does such a good job talking about it, I figured that I would focus on something a little bit different, whether there was actually a Trojan War. Now, the best story about the Trojan War comes from the Greek poet Homer. He wrote in about 700 BC. And his version of events is called the Iliad and the Odyssey, although most likely they were actually written by separate people. But those are the oldest written sources about the Trojan War. The issue is that, according to Homer's writings themselves, the Trojan War probably happened around 1200 BC. The intriguing thing about that date is it lines up with the Bronze Age collapse. So maybe the Trojan War was so massive that it's actually part of the Bronze Age collapse. And that's a really intriguing possibility that a lot of historians and archaeologists are keen to explore. But, of course, there are a few issues with that. 500 years is an awful long time for the first written account of an event, and that means we can't trust it implicitly. And also, Homer doesn't get many of his facts straight. For example, when he talks about chariot warfare, he imagines people taking chariots like taxis out to the battlefield, jumping off, and then fighting man on man against their enemies. Which is very heroic, but not very accurate. He also involves all these stories of gods and mystical events happening during the war too, and that should raise some suspicion. But there are some really important archaeological discoveries that might show that Greeks actually did fight against a city called Troy in the Bronze Age. So the first thing to remember is that Anatolia, the region where Troy is currently located, was ruled by a group called the Hittites. The Hittites were a great empire, and they often faced revolts against their subjects. And we actually have Hittite records that Troy revolted against the Hittites multiple times. And in one of those revolts, we actually also have a record that a group called the Ahiawans were part of the revolt. Homer calls the Greeks Achaeans, which sounds very close to Ahiawans, and most historians believe that Ahiawan and Achaean refer to the same group. They're just two different ways of spelling it based on two different language systems. So we have good evidence that there were Achaeans who often participated in Hittite affairs. Now the next piece of evidence is really intriguing. We actually have a Mycenean style sword engraved with a braggadocious message from a Hittite king claiming to have defeated them in his own territory. So now we have an actual artifact that places the Greeks in Anatolia in the right time period. Now the final piece of the puzzle is Troy itself. Troy was famously rediscovered in the 19th century by the celebrity archaeologist Heinrich Schliemann, who basically dynamited the place to smithereens. But from what modern archaeologists can tell, there was a war around 1200 BC. We can see signs of fire and arrowheads and other military damage against Troy from the time period. So with all that in mind, it seems likely that there were Greeks operating in Anatolia. There was a war against Troy, and it might have been the Greeks, but we can't make that final link. And what we certainly can't do is take Homer at his word about such affairs as the Trojan horse, the might of Achilles, and the actual specifics of his narrative. But we can be relatively certain that there was a war in Troy at the right time period. So when you're reading Homer this week, I encourage you to think about what parts of it make sense for the Bronze Age and what parts of it you think Homer probably exaggerated. And when we talk about Greece later, I'm going to talk about Homer again, and we're going to look at him not as a great example of the Bronze Age, but as a great example of Dark Age Greece. I'll see you in discussion.